the sole black man known to have been a passenger on the Titanic. For many decades, his legacy was obscured by time until his account finally emerged 83 years later. This is a deeply moving and evocative chronicle, so please pause, settle in, and attend closely. Before we commence, remember to subscribe to our channel and post a comment sharing the city and country where you are located. Your engagement ensures these obscured histories are preserved rather than lost to time. Let us begin. On the evening of April 14, 1912, the grandest vessel ever constructed was traversing the North Atlantic at maximum velocity. The sea was tranquil, the firmament was clear, and over 2,000 souls were resting in peace, oblivious to the fact that within hours the majority of them would perish. Amidst those travelers was a man whose experiences would remain concealed for nearly a century. His name was Joseph-Philippe Lemercier Laroche. He was 25 years old. He was a skilled engineer. He was fluent in 3 languages and stood as the only black individual voyaging on the RMS Titanic. Yet, you have never encountered his name in a film. You have never witnessed his likeness in a documentary. For 83 years, the world neglected his existence until his daughter, at the age of 84, chose to end the silence and recount the true events of that night. This is a tale of affection, prejudice, bravery, and a commitment that went unfulfilled. It starts not upon the waves, but on a tiny Caribbean isle in a residence that carried the scent of roasted coffee and ocean spray. Joseph arrived in this world on May 26, 1886, in a seaside city named Cap Haitien in northern Haiti. During that era, Haiti was a nation still mending from decades of political turmoil. However, Joseph's lineage was distinct. They were not impoverished. They were not destitute. His father served as a former military official with government ties. His mother, Telusme, originated from a respected family within the Haitian upper class. They resided in a home with wooden shutters and a garden blossoming with tropical flora. Joseph matured, listening to French dialogue at the family table. His parents prioritized schooling. They maintained that wisdom was the sole possession no one could strip away from an individual. From his earliest years, they recognized a unique spark in their son. Joseph was inquisitive. He sought answers about everything. He desired to understand the mechanics of the world. He would disassemble antique timepieces just to inspect the internal cogs. He would observe the vessels entering the docks and marvel at how such massive objects could remain buoyant. His mother took note of this. She understood that Haiti, at that juncture, could not provide her son with the superior education he merited. The institutions were restricted. The prospects were scarce. She held a vision for him. She aspired for Joseph to become an engineer. Not merely any technician, but a European-educated engineer, one who could construct bridges and invent machinery, someone who could return to his homeland one day to assist in the nation's progress. Consequently, when Joseph reached 15 years of age in 1901, his mother reached a conclusion that would alter his destiny indefinitely. She sent him to France. This was no minor excursion. In 1901, voyaging from Haiti to France required weeks. Joseph embarked on a steamship with a modest bag and a formal recommendation from his father. He remained quiet during the crossing. He spent much of his time on the deck, gazing at the horizon, envisioning what Europe might resemble. He had viewed illustrations in volumes. He had listened to anecdotes from kin who had toured Paris, yet nothing could prepare him for the reality he was about to face. When the vessel eventually reached the harbor of Le Havre, Joseph set foot on French territory for the first time. He was solitary. He was 15, and he was a black youth in a land where nearly everyone was white. Joseph traveled by rail to a city called Beauvais, situated roughly 80 kilometers north of Paris. This was the location of his studies. This was where he would spend the following several years of his life. The town was quaint with stone-paved streets and ancient masonry. The winters were harsh, far colder than anything Joseph had known in Haiti. Yet, he persevered. He secured a small room for rent. He registered for classes and commenced his engineering studies with a level of concentration that awed his instructors. Joseph was not merely intelligent, he was resolute. He rose early every day. He labored late into the evening. He mastered French syntax until he could compose more skillfully than most of his peers. He mastered mathematics, physics, and technical illustration. He sought to demonstrate that a black man from Haiti could rival anyone in Europe. However, France presented challenges for Joseph. The citizens were civil but aloof. Many had never encountered a black person before. They would fixate on him in public. They would mutter when he entered a space. Joseph learned to disregard it. He centered himself on his academics. He convinced himself that once he obtained his credentials, everything would transform. People would honor him for his expertise, rather than evaluate him by his complexion. He believed this with total conviction. For a time, it appeared he was correct. Joseph finished his engineering degree in the early years of the 20th century. He felt immense pride. His mother felt immense pride. He had achieved exactly what she had envisioned. But when Joseph began searching for employment, he stumbled upon a reality that would distress him for his remaining years. No firm desired to employ a black engineer. It was irrelevant that he possessed the same certification as everyone else. It was irrelevant that he spoke flawless French. It was irrelevant that he was brilliant and diligent. When recruiters saw his appearance, they suddenly claimed no roles were available. When he sent in his credentials, they were brushed aside. When he arrived for discussions, he was informed the vacancy had been filled. Joseph sent applications to scores of businesses, technical firms, building companies, state offices. The response remained constant. No. This was France during the early 1900s. Bias was not codified into legislation as it was in the United States. There were no placards indicating whites only. There were no separate facilities or rail sections. However, exclusion persisted in more subtle forms. It lived in the manner people regarded you. It lived in the prospects that were never provided. It lived in the entrances that remained bolted. Joseph sensed it every single day, and it was taxing his spirit. He eventually secured work, but not the profession for which he had trained. He accepted minor roles, low-wage spots that did not utilize his technical expertise. He labored more intensely than anyone else, hoping someone would recognize his capability. But advancements never arrived. Increments never arrived. He was constantly bypassed for white colleagues who possessed less tenure and less schooling. Joseph was stagnant, and he was beginning to lose his optimism. But then an event occurred that altered everything. In the town of Villejuif, just south of Paris, Joseph encountered a young lady named Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue. She was the daughter of a local wine merchant. She possessed chestnut hair, gentle eyes, and a grin that made Joseph dismiss all his hardships. Juliette was white, her lineage was French, and in 1908, falling for a black man was not something that community standards endorsed. But Juliette was indifferent to those standards. She cared for Joseph. She perceived the individual beyond the skin tone. She perceived his brilliance, his warmth, his grit, and she fell for him entirely. They were introduced through a family acquaintance who had been guiding Joseph. Initially, their dialogues were civil and reserved, but as weeks transitioned into months, a more profound bond formed. Joseph would visit the home of Juliette. They would stroll together through the paths of Villejuif. They would converse about literature, about aspirations, about the days to come. Joseph had never encountered anyone like her. She was inquisitive about Haiti. She wished to learn of his youth, of his mother, of the vessels he used to track at the harbor. She attended to him in a manner no one else ever had. The father of Juliette was displeased with the partnership. A wine merchant in France had a status to maintain. Having his daughter wed a black man would spark a scandal. It would damage his enterprise. It would make the household the target of rumors. But Juliette was firm. She informed her father that she adored Joseph. She informed him that she intended to marry him regardless of his blessing. Eventually, her father relented. Perhaps he observed how much joy Joseph brought to his daughter. Perhaps he understood that opposing her was futile. On March 18, 1908, Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche and Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue were wed in a modest ceremony. Joseph was 21 years old. Juliette was 20, and despite all the hurdles, they were finally united. The initial years of their union were joyful, yet demanding. Joseph was still fighting to find suitable employment. The exclusion had not ceased. If anything, it had intensified. Now he was not merely a black man, he was a black man with a white spouse. Some individuals could not tolerate this. They regarded him with transparent disdain. They refused to engage in trade with him. They made existence as arduous as possible. But Joseph and Juliette endured. They leased a small flat. They lived frugally. And on February 19, 1909, their first daughter arrived. They christened her Simone. She possessed her mother's gaze and her father's grin. Joseph cradled her and wept. He vowed to himself that he would provide this child a superior existence. He would discover a path. A year later, on July 2, 1910, their second daughter arrived. They christened her Louise. But unlike Simone, Louise was not a robust infant. She arrived prematurely. She was tiny and frail. The physicians suggested she might not pull through. Joseph and Juliette spent weeks at her side, pleading, hoping, and refusing to surrender. Slowly, tiny Louise gained vigor. She survived, but her health struggles persisted. She required perpetual attention. She required costly care. And Joseph, with his meager wages, was fighting to cover the expenses. The circumstances were becoming critical. Joseph was working excessive hours at roles that barely provided for the rent. Juliette was tending to two small toddlers while expecting a third. Indeed, by early 1912, Juliette had realized she was anticipating another infant. This should have been joyful tidings, but for Joseph, it was another source of anxiety. How would he provide for 3 youngsters on his earnings? How would he fund the medical care for Louise? How would he offer his household the life they merited? Then Joseph conceived a plan. He would return to Haiti. It was perfectly logical. In Haiti, Joseph would not be evaluated by his race. In Haiti, his engineering credentials would actually carry weight. His family possessed influence. His mother was still living and highly regarded. He could secure a career. He could establish a real profession. He could offer his offspring chances that France would never provide them. Joseph discussed his intent with Juliette. At first, she was uncertain. She had never visited Haiti. She did not know Creole. She would be abandoning her kin, her nation, and everything familiar. But she placed her faith in Joseph. She believed in him, and she consented to depart. Joseph wrote to his mother in Haiti, detailing the circumstances. His mother was thrilled. She had longed for her son immensely. She had always anticipated his return, and she instantly offered her support. She would purchase the family's passage to Haiti. She would ensure they had all necessities upon their arrival. Joseph felt a burden lift from his spirit. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful. The primary plan was to depart France in late 1912 or early 1913. But when Juliette realized she was pregnant, Joseph opted to accelerate the schedule. He did not wish for her to travel when the pregnancy was too far along. He desired for the infant to be born in Haiti, surrounded by relatives. His mother bought first-class tickets for the household on a French liner named the SS France. The vessel was set to leave in April 1912. Everything was set, everything was ideal. But then Joseph discovered a detail that changed everything. The SS France maintained a rigid rule regarding youngsters. All children voyaging on the vessel were mandated to remain in the nursery during meal hours. They were forbidden from dining with their parents. Joseph found this intolerable. Simone was 3 years old. Louise was not even 2. They were infants. He could not contemplate leaving them with strangers while he and Juliet took dinner in a lavish hall. It contradicted everything he held dear as a parent. He wished to be with his girls. He wished to see their reactions when they tasted new flavors. He wished to comfort Louise if she became frightened. The rule of the SS France was heartless and unnecessary, and Joseph refused to comply. He visited the agency and requested a refund. Then he began searching for a different vessel, and that is when he learned of the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was the largest ship on Earth. It was brand new. It was embarking on its debut voyage from Southampton, England to New York City. Everyone was discussing it. The journals called it impossible to sink. They described it as a floating palace with amenities that no other vessel could equal. First-class travelers would have entry to a gym, a pool, Turkish baths and eateries that matched the finest spots in Paris. Even second-class rooms were reported to be superior to first-class on other ships. Most crucially, the Titanic did not enforce the same rigid rules about children. Joseph could eat with his daughters. He could spend his time with them during the crossing. He could be the parent he aspired to be. Joseph traded the first-class tickets on the SS France for second-class passage on the Titanic. The family would board the ship in Cherbourg, France on April 10, 1912. From there they would cross to New York, and from New York they would board another ship to Haiti. It was a longer trek, but Joseph did not care. He was thrilled. He was finally bringing his household home. The days prior to the start were frantic. Juliet packed their items. Joseph settled the details for their flat. He bid farewell to the few associates he had established in France. He sent messages to kin in Haiti, informing them to wait for the family shortly. Simone and Louise did not grasp the events. They were too young, but they could feel the anticipation in the atmosphere. Their father was grinning more frequently. Their mother was vocalizing songs as she tidied garments. Something magnificent was about to occur. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the La Roche household traveled to Cherbourg by rail. Cherbourg was a harbour town on the northern edge of France, renowned for its profound bay. The Titanic was too immense to pull up to the dock, so travellers had to be moved to the ship on smaller vessels known as tenders. The tender that would transport the La Roche family was the SS Nomadic. It was a rugged little ship painted white with the White Star Line banner streaming from its pole. Joseph carried Louise in his arms as they stepped onto the tender. Simone grasped her mother's hand, surveying the scene with eyes wide open. Clothing. Several people observed the La Roche family with a sense of wonder. Others stared with a different expression entirely. Joseph took note. He was always observant, but he refused to let it trouble him. Not on this day. Today marked the threshold of a fresh existence. As the small ferry drew closer to the Titanic, Joseph caught sight of the vessel for the first time, and his breath hitched. It was gargantuan. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The hull emerged from the sea like a dark steel barrier, extending so far up that Joseph had to lean his head back to glimpse the summit. 4 enormous funnels pointed toward the heavens, decorated in the unique shades of the White Star Line, a sandy yellow with black rims. The ship was longer than any building Joseph had ever set foot in. It seemed permanent. It seemed indomitable. It seemed like an object that could never, ever go under. The tender pulled alongside the craft, and travellers began ascending a gangway toward the second-class entry. Joseph assisted Juliet, who was now clearly pregnant. He shifted Louise, who had drifted off to sleep, against his neck. Simon strolled between her parents, holding onto her favorite doll. The family set foot on the Titanic at roughly 6:30 in the evening. The sun was starting to descend. The ship's band was performing somewhere in the distance, and Joseph Laroche, the only black man on the vessel, inhaled deeply and smiled. They had arrived. Their room was situated on Deck E in the second-class area of the ship. It was compact but cozy. There were 2 bunks, a wash basin, and a porthole that overlooked the waves. The walls were finished in white. The linens were spotless. Compared to their residence in France, it felt almost grand. Juliet sat on the mattress and let out a sigh. The journey had been draining. The pregnancy was leaving her weary, but she was joyful. She looked at Joseph and reached for his hand. That initial night on the Titanic, the family shared dinner in the second-class dining hall. The room was gorgeous. Wood-paneled walls, white linens, crystal stemware. Servers in sharp uniforms glided between tables, delivering course after course. Simon was mesmerized by everything. Louise slept in her mother's lap. Joseph requested food he had never sampled before. He chuckled at something Juliet mentioned. For a few hours he brushed aside the prejudice. He forgot about the hardships. He was simply a father having a meal with his family on the most celebrated ship on Earth. However, not everyone was welcoming. Some travelers in the dining area gazed at the Laroche family. A black man with a white spouse and 2 mixed-race children was not a frequent sight in 1912. Some people whispered, some people gestured. Joseph caught fragments of talk, remarks that were not intended for him to hear, but that he grasped perfectly. He acted as if he didn't notice. He concentrated on Juliet. He concentrated on his girls. He refused to let anyone spoil this moment. Over the following days, the Laroche family established a routine. Joseph would get up early and stroll around the deck, inhaling the salty air, observing the infinite ocean reach toward the horizon. Juliet would remain in the cabin with the little ones, reading stories, playing games, resting. They would gather for meals. They would discuss Haiti. Joseph described the beaches to Juliet, the mountains, and the house where he was raised. He spoke of the dishes his mother used to prepare. He told her about the rhythm of drums during the carnival season. Juliet absorbed every word. She was falling in love with a land she had never visited. The other travelers continued to treat the Laroche family with a blend of curiosity and coldness. Some speculated the children were not actually theirs. One lady reportedly thought Simon and Louise were Japanese because of their tan skin and dark hair. Joseph overheard remarks in English and French. He grasped both tongues perfectly, but he never replied. He never confronted anyone. He simply held his posture high and kept walking. He had spent his whole life dealing with people who thought they were superior to him. He was not going to drain his energy on them. Now on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, the Laroche family went to a church service in the second-class dining room. It was a short, non-denominational gathering led by the ship's commander, Edward Smith. Passengers sang hymns. They offered prayers. They gave thanks for the pleasant weather and the steady voyage. Joseph sat with his family in one of the rear rows. He was not especially religious, but he valued the moment of stillness. He shut his eyes and thought about his mother in Haiti. He pictured her face when she saw him once more. He pictured her holding her granddaughters for the first time. In just a few more days, they would be together. After the service, Joseph did something out of the ordinary. He went to the second-class smoking room. This was a place where men gathered to converse, drink, and play cards. Joseph rarely mingled with strangers. He preferred to spend time with Juliet and the girls, but something prompted him to go that day. Perhaps he wanted to unwind. Perhaps he wanted to feel normal like any other passenger on the vessel. He found a chair in the corner. He ordered a beverage. He watched the other men laughing and joking, and for a second he felt like he belonged. That evening the family had their final meal together. The menu featured lamb, roast beef, greens, and a variety of desserts. Simon finished everything on her plate. Louise was fussy as usual. Juliet looked weary, but satisfied. Joseph looked at his family across the table and felt a rush of love so intense it almost pained him. These three people were everything to him. He had crossed seas for them. He had endured prejudice for them. He would do anything to keep them protected. After dinner, Juliet took the children back to the room. Joseph kissed each of them good night. He told Simon to be a good girl. He told Louise that Papa loved her. He told Juliet that he would be in bed shortly. Then he went back to the smoking room. He wanted to savor the last peaceful hours of the trip. Tomorrow they would reach New York. Tomorrow the real journey would start. At 11:40 p.m., Joseph felt a minor tremor run through the vessel. He looked up from his glass. The other men in the smoking room had sensed it too. Someone cracked a joke about striking a whale. Someone else gave a nervous laugh. The ship's engines seemed to halt. The room became very silent. Joseph stood up. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut. He walked out of the smoking room and onto the deck. The night was biting cold. The stars were incredibly vivid, and scattered across the deck were shards of ice, small bits like shattered glass, sparkling in the light from the ship's windows. Joseph picked one up. It was freezing and wet in his palm. He looked toward the front of the ship and saw something that made his heart stop. A gargantuan wall of white was scraping along the starboard side of the Titanic. An iceberg. Joseph dropped the ice and sprinted toward his cabin. Joseph ran through the hallways of the ship like a man possessed. His heart was thumping so hard he could feel it in his throat. His breath came in short, sharp gasps that stung his lungs. The corridors of the Titanic, which had seemed so sophisticated and welcoming just hours prior, now felt like a labyrinth designed to snare him. He turned left, he turned right. He nearly crashed into a steward who was walking calmly in the other direction, as if nothing had occurred, as if the world was not ending. The steward was a young man, maybe 20 years old, with a pale face and a neat white uniform. He told Joseph there was nothing to worry about. He said the ship had bumped some ice, but everything was under control. He said the passengers should go back to their rooms and wait for further news. His voice was steady. His hands were not trembling. But Joseph saw something in his eyes, something that denied every word coming out of his mouth. It was fear. Pure, undeniable terror. Joseph did not trust him. He pushed past the steward and kept running. The corridors were starting to fill with confused travelers. Some were still in their nightgowns and pajamas, their hair messy, their eyes heavy with interrupted sleep. Others were fully dressed, carrying bags and valuables, as if they were simply getting ready to get off at a scheduled stop. A woman was sobbing somewhere nearby. A child was asking questions that no one could answer. The ship's lights blinked once, twice, then stayed on again. Joseph felt the floor beneath his feet slant slightly, almost unnoticeably, toward the front. Something was very, very wrong. When he reached the cabin on deck E, he threw open the door with such force that it hit the wall. Juliet was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with confusion and the start of terror. Her hands were pressed against her pregnant stomach as if to protect the child growing inside her. The children were still asleep. Louise was curled up in her small bed, her thumb in her mouth, her breathing slow and quiet. Simon was sprawled across her mattress, one arm hanging over the side, her favorite doll gripped against her chest. The impact had been so gentle, so deceptively light, that it had not even broken their dreams. Juliet asked Joseph what was going on. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman trying very hard not to lose control, but Joseph could see the panic starting to form behind her eyes. He could see her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the blankets away. He told her to get dressed. He told her to dress the children warmly. He told her they needed to go up to the deck right away. He did not explain why. There was no time for explanations. There was no time for questions. Every second they spent in this cabin was a second closer to tragedy. Juliet moved fast. She was 7 months pregnant, and her body was heavy and slow, but the adrenaline gave her energy she did not know she possessed. She pulled a thick wool coat over her nightgown. She grabbed wraps and hats from the small closet. She wrapped Simon in a blanket, lifting the sleepy child from the bed with a mother's expert efficiency. Simon mumbled something, unclear, and leaned against her mother's shoulder. Louise was harder to wake. She whimpered and cried when Juliet lifted her, her small body stiff with protest. But there was no time for comfort. There was no time for gentle words. Joseph grabbed the life vests that were stored in the cabin. He had noticed them when they first got on, tucked away in a corner near the closet, and had thought nothing of them at the time. They had seemed like a formality, a safety measure for a danger that would never happen. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. The papers said so. The company said so. The captain himself probably believed it. But now those life vests seemed like the most important items in the world. Joseph pulled them out and checked them quickly. They were made of cork, covered in white canvas, with ties that fastened around the chest and waist. They were bulky and annoying, but they would keep a person floating. They would buy time. Joseph helped Juliet put on her life vest, his fingers struggling with the unfamiliar ties. He fastened one around Simon, who was now fully awake and starting to cry. He held Louise while Juliet fixed the ties on her own jacket, the little girl moving and wailing in his arms. She did not grasp what was happening. She did not grasp why her father's hands were shaking. She only knew that something was wrong, something was different, and she was frightened. The family left the room and made their way toward the upper decks. The corridors were more packed now. Passengers were coming out of their rooms, some moving with aim, others standing frozen in confusion. Stewards were everywhere, their voices fake calm, their directions maddeningly vague. Please go to the boat deck. Please put on your life vests. Please remain calm. But how could anyone stay calm when the floor was slanting? How could anyone stay calm when the lights kept blinking? How could anyone stay calm when the greatest vessel ever constructed was dying beneath their feet? Joseph led his family through the maze of hallways, up staircases that grew more packed with each passing minute. He held Louise in one arm and pulled Juliet with the other. Simon held onto her mother's coat, her small legs trying to keep up, her face white with terror. The noises around them were deafening, crying, shouting, praying, the distant bang of something heavy falling somewhere, deep in the ship. The groan of steel under pressure, and beneath it all, a horrible subtle noise that Joseph would recall for the rest of his life, the sound of water rushing, pouring, unstoppable water flooding into the lower levels of the ship. When they finally reached the boat deck, Joseph grasped the full scale of the catastrophe. The deck was a mess. Hundreds of passengers were gathered near the lifeboats, pushing, shoving, sobbing, praying. Officers in white uniforms were yelling orders that no one seemed to listen to. Crew members were battling with ropes and pulleys, trying to lower the boats into the sea. Women were screaming for their husbands. Children were calling for their parents. The cold was vicious, far worse than anything Joseph had felt in his years in France. The temperature was below freezing, and every breath felt like inhaling ice. The stars above were impossibly vivid, indifferent to the pain below, and the ship's band was performing. Joseph could hardly believe it. In the middle of this nightmare, a group of musicians stood on the deck, their instruments in their hands, playing cheerful tunes as if this were a lawn party. The music was surreal, almost insulting in its normalcy. It clashed violently with the screams and the mess, creating a sound that made the whole scene feel like a fever dream. Later, Joseph would discover that the orchestra had been told to play to keep the passengers quiet. Later, he would grasp the courage of those musicians who continued playing even as the ship went down beneath them. But in that moment, the music only made everything worse. Joseph pushed through the crowd, his eyes checking the lifeboats. He needed to find one that was still filling. He needed to get his family off this ship. The Titanic was sinking. He could feel it now, the clear tilt of the deck, the way gravity was moving beneath his feet. The bow was going down, the stern was rising, time was ending. He spotted a lifeboat on the port side of the vessel. An officer was standing nearby calling for travelers. "Women and children first," he kept yelling. "Women and children first." It was the law of the sea. It was the code of honor. Men would wait, men would find another way. Men would perish so that women and children could survive. Joseph grasped the rule. He accepted the rule. But accepting it did not make it any simpler. Juliet looked at Joseph with tears pouring down her face. The cold wind was biting at her cheeks, turning her skin red and sore. She did not want to leave him. She gripped his arm with a power he did not know she had. Her fingers digging into his coat, her eyes begging him to come with them. Joseph shook his head. He could not. He knew he could not. The officer was watching. The rules were clear. If Joseph tried to enter the lifeboat, he would be halted. He would be shoved back. He might even be shot. He had heard tales about officers using weapons to keep order during wrecks. He would not risk it. He would not risk his family's chance to live. He told Juliet that he would find another way. He told her that there were more lifeboats on the other side of the vessel. He told her that he would see her in New York. He told her to be brave, to take care of the girls, to never forget how much he loved her. His voice was steady, but inside he was falling apart. Inside, he was screaming. He did not want to let her go. He did not want to watch his family vanish into the blackness. But he had no choice. The officer gestured quickly for Juliet to enter the lifeboat. Other ladies were already getting in, their faces white with shock, panic, their motions clumsy and frantic. Juliet paused. She gazed at Joseph one final time, memorizing his features, searing his image into her thoughts. He was clutching Louise in his arms, the toddler's face tucked against his shoulder, her tiny frame shivering with cold and terror. Simon was standing between them, peering up at her parents with eyes that did not grasp the reality of the situation. Joseph handed Louise to Juliet. The exchange was difficult, hampered by the life vests and the throng and the swaying of the vessel. Louise wailed as she moved from her father's grasp to her mother's. Joseph kissed his daughter's brow, his lips staying on her chilled skin. He murmured that Papa loved her. He murmured that everything would be all right. Then he hoisted Simon and set her in the lifeboat beside her mother. The 3-year-old instantly began to sob, reaching for her father with both arms, her small voice slicing through the noise like a blade. But something went wrong. In the turmoil in the crowd, the lifeboat started to lower before everyone was properly positioned. Juliet and Simon were shoved toward one side of the craft by the wave of boarding passengers, while Louise was still in Joseph's arms. He had handed her toward Juliet, but somehow in the madness, the child had been shifted back. Or perhaps he had not released her. Perhaps he had been holding her one moment too long, savoring the weight of his daughter in his arms, not realizing that the boat was already moving down. The ropes squeaked, the pulleys groaned. The lifeboat fell several feet, then halted, swaying slightly in the freezing air. Juliet shrieked. She could see Louise still on the deck, still in Joseph's arms, getting more distant with each passing second. She reached out, her arms stretched toward her infant, her face contorted with a sorrow that was almost beyond human. Joseph tried to shove forward, but there were too many individuals. Bodies pressed against him from every side. A crewman was obstructing his path, his arms spread wide, his face stern and wary. The crewman saw a black man trying to get to the lifeboat and assumed the worst. He thought Joseph was trying to board. He thought Joseph was trying to take a spot that belonged to women and children. He did not see a father trying to rejoin his family. He saw a threat. Joseph yelled. He pleaded. He pointed at Juliet in the lifeboat. He pointed at Louise in his arms. "That is her mother," he cried. "This is her daughter. Please let me give her the baby." But the crewman did not budge. The crewman did not pay attention. The seconds were vanishing. The lifeboat was going down, and Louise was still on the deck of the foundering ship. In that instant, Joseph made a choice that would haunt Juliet for the rest of her existence. He turned to a stranger standing beside him, a woman he had never met before and would never see again, and shoved Louise into her arms. The woman was startled, confused, but Joseph did not give her time to respond. He begged her to pass the child to the woman in the boat. He pointed at Juliet, whose screams were now so intense they could be heard over the noise. "That is her mother," he said. "Please, please give her the baby. Save my daughter." The stranger looked at the weeping child in her arms. She looked at the lifeboat moving into the shadows. She looked at the black man with tears pouring down his face. And then she did something that Joseph would never be able to thank her for. She leaned over the side and passed Louise down to another passenger standing below, who passed her to another and another, a chain of strangers joined by a single goal. Until finally, the little girl reached Juliet's waiting arms. Mother and daughter were reunited. The lifeboat continued to descend. Joseph stood at the rail and watched his family vanish into the gloom. The lifeboat hit the black water with a splash that seemed incredibly loud in the silence of the night. Crew members began rowing, pulling away from the sinking ship, putting space between themselves and the disaster. Joseph could see Juliet's face in the faint light growing smaller and smaller as the boat moved away. Their eyes met across the widening gap. She was weeping. She was holding both daughters against her chest, one in each arm, as if she could protect them from the entire world. She mouthed something to him. He could not hear the words over the wind and the noise, but he understood. She was telling him she loved him. She was telling him to survive. She was telling him to find a way. Joseph raised his hand in a final wave. He tried to smile. He wanted her last memory of him to be a smile. He wanted her to remember him as courageous, as strong, as full of hope. He did not want her to see the terror in his spirit. He did not want her to know that he had already accepted his end. The lifeboat vanished into the dark, and Joseph was alone. He did not move for a long time. He stood at the rail, his hands clutching the cold metal, his eyes fixed on the spot where the lifeboat had gone. The Titanic was leaning badly now, tilting forward at an angle that made it hard to stand. Water was pouring into the lower decks through holes in the hull. The bow was going under, the stern was rising, the great ship was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to rescue it. Around Joseph, chaos persisted. Passengers were running in every direction, looking for lifeboats that were already gone. Officers were firing pistols into the air, trying to keep order. Men were leaping into the freezing water, preferring a fast death to the slow pain of waiting. The band had stopped playing. The lights were blinking more often now, casting the deck in alternating brightness and shadow. The cries of the dying and the desperate filled the air like a symphony of grief. Joseph walked back toward the second-class smoking room. He did not know why. Perhaps he wanted to be somewhere familiar. Perhaps he wanted to be away from the crowds and the screaming. Perhaps he simply needed a moment to think, to reflect, to accept what was occurring. The smoking room was nearly empty when he arrived. A few men sat at tables drinking spirits, playing cards, waiting for the finish. They had accepted their end. They knew there were not enough lifeboats. They knew that the water was freezing. They knew that even if they jumped, they would not survive more than a few minutes. So they sat, and they drank, and they waited. Joseph sat down in the same chair where he had been sitting just 2 hours before. The same chair where he had been dreaming about Haiti. The same chair where he had been picturing his mother's face when she saw him again. He thought about Juliet. He thought about Simon and Louise. He thought about the baby that Juliet was carrying, the child who would never meet its father. He thought about his mother in Haiti, who would get a letter in a few weeks telling her that her son was dead. He thought about all the things he would never do, all the places he would never see, all the moments he would never share with the people he loved, and he thought about the life he had lived. 25 years. That was all he had been granted. 25 years of struggle, of prejudice, of fighting for every chance. He had left Haiti as a boy and crossed an ocean to get an education. He had studied harder than anyone else, worked longer than anyone else, and still it had not been enough. The color of his skin had followed him everywhere, closing doors that should have been open, denying him chances that others took for granted. He had loved and been loved. He had married a woman who saw past his color, who loved him for who he was. He had fathered 2 beautiful daughters and was expecting a 3rd child. He had tried so hard to build a good life, a significant life, and now it was ending on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Joseph closed his eyes. He thought about Juliet in the lifeboat holding their daughters close. He imagined them being rescued. He imagined them arriving in New York, then traveling to Haiti, then starting a new life without him. He imagined his children growing up, going to school, falling in love, having children of their own. He imagined Juliet growing old, her hair turning grey, her face lined with the years. He hoped she would find joy. He hoped she would find peace. He hoped she would tell their children about him, about the father who had loved them more than life itself. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic broke apart and vanished beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. The sound was unlike anything the survivors had ever heard. A deep, groaning roar as the ship tore in two, a thunderous crash as the bow plunged into the depths, a moment of eerie quiet as the stern rose vertical, pointing toward the stars like a dark finger accusing the heavens, and then the screams, hundreds and hundreds of screams as more than 2,500 people were plunged into water so cold it stopped their hearts within minutes. Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche was among the dead. His body was never found. The lifeboats drifted in the darkness for hours, surrounded by the cries of the dying. The passengers huddled together for warmth, their bodies shaking with cold and shock. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared into the dark with empty eyes, unable to process what they had witnessed. The screams from the water gradually faded as the cold claimed its victims. Within an hour, there was only silence, a terrible, absolute silence that seemed to swallow the whole world. Juliet held her daughters close throughout the night. She did not sleep. She did not speak. She simply held Simon and Louise against her body, trying to keep them warm, trying to keep them alive. Her eyes never left the horizon. She kept hoping to see Joseph in another lifeboat. She kept telling herself that he had found a way to survive. He was smart. He was resourceful. He had promised her they would meet again in New York. Joseph had never broken a promise to her. He would not start now. But as the hours passed, hope began to wither. The other lifeboats came together, sharing survivors, sharing information, sharing grief. No one had seen Joseph. No one had seen a black man in any of the boats. Juliet's heart sank with each passing minute. She began to understand what she had been refusing to accept.